Ashton, I can't picture you being small and skinny. I can't picture that in my head because that is such the opposite of who you are now.
Yeah,
Um,
I was thin. I was very strong, but I was thin.
what's going on, everyone? This is Kristen Dunsmore, and this is the Evolve podcast. And I am sitting here today with our founder, CEO, Garrett Blevins, and DDS founder, Zach Robinson, and another high-level person that many of you may know is Ashton Rouska. So, Ashton, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me on here, guys.
Yeah, thanks for being on here. So I wanted to just ask you a little bit about how you got into powerlifting in the first place. And then, I mean, I think you've been competing actually longer than I have by about a year. So from 2013 to now and how things have changed since then.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I've been competing since 2013. I did my first meet out of I believe it was Southside Gym in Anchorage, Alaska, and then from there I kept competing and did like my first world championship when I was sort of 17 years old. I think that was 2014. That was in Orosháza, Hungary. That was a good time. That was single ply, which at that time, single ply, especially high school and stuff like that, was far more sort of the common route that you would take. And then after that, just kind of continued to compete raw and continued to travel with it and to have a lot of fun with it. So it's been a really good 12-year run so far.
Ash, what was your training like when you first started? Like, if you can think back to when you first picked up a barbell and you were training out there, what was it like?
It was actually surprisingly, it wasn't that much different from some of the stuff that I do now. It kind of evolved over time and the pendulum kind of swung back eventually, and I kind of went back to what I was initially doing. During that time, I did relatively low volume on like the big three, but I would just do like, a couple of like ascending sets and just go a bit heavier each session and add a little more weight each week. And after 5 or 6 weeks, you'd start over. That was pretty much what I did. And I did that mostly through competing in sports and stuff like that too. It was actually a sports coach who had introduced me to powerlifting, and that's the reason I had tried it in the first place.
That was gonna be my question. Is just I'm interested in because I mean immediately that sounds like you were doing something relatively productive pretty early on, which is always the norm. So what from like a sporting background or just those kind of early influences, what kind of set you up on that path of success so early on? I'm curious.
Yeah, more than anything, I think I was kind of, well, when I was very, very young, I was kind of the type of kid that would seek individuals that I sort of, wanted to emulate. That included, in the strength training world and stuff like that. I was a relatively skinny kid and I wanted to, beef up and get some more muscle and stuff. I met a lot of guys, who were in the military at the time, actually, never competed in powerlifting or anything, but a lot of them were a little bit older, they were ridiculously strong, especially for non-powerlifters, and, had just trained for a long time and learned a lot, about training and lifting and stuff like that. And I got a lot of my early sort of training and tips and stuff like that from guys like that. And I sort of sought that out as a kid. And since I was like very hungry for knowledge and receptive, a lot of them were almost always like very willing to help no matter how mean they looked. They were all good dudes. So yeah, had to check them
Ashton,
out.
I can't picture you being small and skinny. I can't picture that in my head because that is such the opposite of who you are now.
Yeah,
Um,
I was thin. I was very strong, but I was thin. Yeah, at
what
first.
was your body weight your first competition?
Maybe like 160, like eight or something.
Oh wow. And you're a 105 now, correct?
Yeah, I compete 105. I
Yeah.
would say this is just a side tangent. I would say 105 is probably my least favorite weight class to compete in. I really
Well,
I like 110 more. I like 100 more. Like if you want to look good, you can do 100. If you want to be really strong, you can do 110. But 105 is just that weird middle ground for me where I don't really feel the best in either. I don't really know why, but yeah.
now I know that feeling. So your last meet you competed in was the Sheffield.
Mhm.
And I know that you were kind of dealing with, was it a shoulder injury like a few weeks before? I know that your squat, you didn't take your third bench, and
Yeah.
your obviously your opener was significantly lower than what it's been. If you want to talk about that and kind of what you've been doing to recover.
Yeah. So about 7 or 8 weeks before that competition, I had a grade 2 pec tear. Um, that actually happened not from like lifting or poor programming or anything like that. But like once every few years or so, I have like a really minor pec strain, and then you just work a few weeks with bands and a little bit lighter, and then you get through it and you fully heal. And I was at that point where I was pretty much almost feeling fully healed from it. I was feeling very good. And I was not in Alabama. I was doing a little like training event there, not powerlifting related. And the day after, like I did like a swim thing and like all this other stuff. That was the day it actually tore. I think I was towing we were towing a very careful and delicate balance, and it was working very well. And I just on that day, I guess I didn't account for, that factor, well enough. And the area that actually it tore at is the area that tends to get very fatigued, like if you're like swimming or in water and stuff. So that was just, kind of a really just nasty sort of unfortunate accident. It completely derailed all of the momentum I had built up for the meet because I was actually, in my opinion, postured very well to potentially win it with how things were going. I was benching over 500 regularly in training, and squats were feeling great, deadlifts were feeling great. But then, like, meet day, you have a great T tear, and it's like, if you squat to get in position, it kind of affects it. That's going to then subsequently affect your bench. And then, with one side being torn, it creates a slight imbalance when you're deadlifting too. So it was really difficult to compete with that period. But I mean, it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. And, even if I wasn't at my best, I could go, have fun, meet people. And I still put up a record squat that day. So it wasn't all for waste.
Honestly, one of the most interesting things about kind of your training history, but also kind of maybe how it influences your training now is, as powerlifting has kind of, reached its kind of, modern, I guess, era of the way that, the average kind of powerlifter does things. I would say one of the probably most glaring differences to me in your overall kind of training history is just how much you have a very solid base of just general physical preparedness and how that is something that continues to exist by the things that you're kind of talking about. I'm curious how much you think that plays to your advantage in some ways, where some people may immediately think, oh, he has these other obligations that maybe potentially take away from his training in some aspects. I'm curious if you think that plays to your strengths in any way. Obviously, in this swimming isolated example, that maybe that was an example where, oh, maybe we kind of pushed it a little bit too far. But in general, I'm curious. Yeah, I'm just curious if you think that additional work capacity, that just general physical preparedness, that kind of
Mhm.
is kind of playing a role throughout your training history, how much that
Yeah, for sure.
maybe plays to your advantage in some ways.
Yeah. No, I think I think just being, a physically, formidable, resilient, individual, being a hardy individual, just purely from a physical standpoint, like what you're alluding to, I think is extremely helpful in powerlifting. And I think also like the longer you do it and the more that you do it and the more, reps and volume that you get over time, I think part of that base and this is your field of expertise, not mine. I think part of that base just kind of lingers around. I mean, I imagine that it's kind of like Ebbinghouse's learning curve, right? I kind of imagine that the better you get at something, the more you do it over a longer period of time, the faster you can kind of pick it up each time you pick it up. Like even if I take it away from myself for a second, like we look at Garrett, right? And a lot of his lifting, like very recently, he's been hitting, some really impressive, lifts and PRs. And I think that just kind of shows like, I think he's had that like physically formidable, resilient sort of like base that's existed. And he's been able to build off of that base, um, versus just not having it, right? Or if you're starting from scratch. I think those are very different things. If you've done it before, it's not always as daunting.
For sure. Yeah, I think the thing that's interesting to me is a specificity pendulum always kind of goes back and forth, right? You have the hyper specific squat every day kind of crowd that, has been somewhat making a resurgent recently with the very high frequency SBD stuff. But then you kind of have on the other end of the spectrum was more of the conjugate west side approaches, which I'm personally very fond of and just the history there. But they, kind of push things on the other end of the spectrum. But I think, if you kind of take the quote unquote enlightened middle ground perspective, some of those general physical preparedness qualities, I think sometimes get a bad rap currently in kind of today's age that is really also is very like here and now driven. Like the entire kind of programming philosophy is like my next week 4 is the most important thing, right? And those kind of things I just think are always really interesting. So with your history and things like that, like I said, I always think people sometimes think other obligations are detractors, where sometimes I think it can kind of work in your favor for building these qualities that you said that I think probably allow you to tolerate training just in a general sense. So I just think that's an interesting thing to kind of get on before we maybe get into the nuts and bolts of what you actually do.
I think it can. Especially, I think one other factor that's important to consider is like how you structure, your training and stuff like that. I mean, as you guys know, I don't do a particularly, insane amount of volume on like the primary sort of like major compound movements that I compete with. I do, I try to get enough, exposure to, a certain threshold sort of a stimulus in order to improve over time, albeit very slowly. But I don't do too much, at the cost of risking, injury or more issues. And it's been very effective lately. I mean, we'll see what happens on the meet at the meet, um, but yeah, I do think having that sort of physical base of resilience is important. I think that getting it through other means aside from just squat, bench, and deadlift is important. I mean, I think there's just tangible benefits outside of, how good of a powerlifter you are too. Like, I mean, just for your health, like in general. I mean, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, yes, like there's like specificity obviously, but a lot of my training volume, as you guys again, I'm seeing it actually does come from like accessory movements or like secondary movements, not necessarily the direct compound movements themselves, usually. Bench is kind of an exception, but even that, there's a lot more volume still achieved through upper body accessories than just the bench press itself.
For sure, Ashton. That's something I noticed in your training. And something else I want to add into the GPP consideration is your physique. Like you are an extremely muscled individual. You mentioned being a little bit lighter, when you started out. You're just absolutely jacked. I remember the first time I saw you at a nationals meet and you were still either a junior, maybe sub-junior. I think you were junior at that point. You're coming up. And all of us, it was Bryce Lewis, Eli Burks, kind of in that realm. And we all kind of looked at each other like, yeah, that's probably the guy that's going to make us all. We could just tell. And so what's that been like for you gaining like the physique that you have from that 160-ish realm that you started at?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I would say up to like 2023, and even now in 2025, like my weight gain, like muscle gain, has been very, very gradual. So for a lot of the people, this is going to sound kind of funny, and this is something I don't normally talk much about, but for the people that are doubters if whether or not I am enhanced or not, I would say just look at the progress in the numbers. Like, yes, I'm very strong. Like, yes, the numbers I lift are very irregular, but the progress isn't necessarily irregular. I mean, let's see. Like, I've been squatting 700 since what? Since I was like the 20-year-old kid. Like, I've been deadlifting 700 since I was a 17-year-old kid. I benched 400 at 17. Like, I very gradually and slowly progressed and gained weight over time and gained muscle mass over time. So, if people saw me they saw me one day, then they saw me 2 years later, they may see a little difference, not huge, but there's people, if I see them like 6 or 8 years later, they obviously notice a bigger difference because more time has elapsed and I've gained more mass. It's been a very gradual and steady process. I've been very patient, and I never really tried to aggressively rush it at any point. And that's kind of paid off, right? So from, 16 years old at, 168, I graduated high school. I hit 200 pounds when I was like 17, 18. So that was probably my biggest growth period, and that can be, chalked up to adolescence and getting into powerlifting more. Um, and then after that, it's been a very slow, gradual, 35 to 40 pound gain from that point over the last several years. So that's kind of how that worked out.
For your time during that weight gain, which is really, overnight success, took a decade sort of a thing, where you built this up over a long period of time. Have you focused on any nutritional aspects in particular, or has it been a pretty regular diet that's been consistent, that's been easy to maintain?
It's been a pretty steady diet, to be honest. I mean, I'm not actually super specific or in the weeds with my dieting. I'm not, completely I'm not completely frivolous with what I eat, right? Like I don't just eat like nonsense and junk all the time. I actually eat pretty healthy, I would say. If I had to put a number to it, just arbitrarily right now, I would say about 93 to 95% of the time I eat healthy. And then that 5 to 7% of the time where I don't, it's usually I'm still eating something healthy that day, but then I'm just like eating something that's not as healthy. But generally
What's the
speaking,
go-to? What's the go-to? I got to know.
the go-to like junk.
Sure.
Let's see. Can I include like liquids?
You can include whatever you want, man.
Okay. Um, yeah, higher alcohol content beers. Um, not a food, but cigar once in a while. And then in terms of actual food, yeah, just pastries. I love cakes. Like I love
Nice.
cookies. I love like waffles with everything on them, pancakes with everything in them. Um, I mean, not everything, but a lot of things. Um,
Sure.
yeah, doused in syrup. I mean, yeah, just those kinds of things. Like I love all of those things. And I genuinely do love them, but I just, I just eat them in moderation. I
Beautiful.
consume those things in moderation. Yeah.
So I had a question for you.
Sure.
And this will kind of lead us into your current training, which I find extremely interesting just because of your background. So you're full-time in the military. You are, I believe, now an official PhD, but
Mhm.
leading up to the past 4 or 5 years, you were in school. You are also married and recently had a kid. Do you have one or two?
One
One, okay. And then
for now.
so full-time in school, has a kid, getting ready to compete. So all of these other outside factors, and you're still considered one of the, strongest 105s in the world. So how are you able to prioritize your training when you have all these other things going on?
Yeah. The one word answer is barely. Um, the longer answer is, I mean, this is something I think I preach pretty regularly. I think what's important is consistent, strung together, disciplined effort and small wins and tiny steps forward, right? For me, it's more of a game of inches, right? So I don't have to take all of these, crazy leaps and bounds like in my training, from like block to block. So I don't set myself up for that expectation. And honestly, it makes it a little bit easier for me to show up, to work hard, and to feel like I did something like productive and valuable, but not so much, but not have to worry or obsess over it so much so to the detriment of everything else that's going on in my life, right? If I, get into the gym, I'm like, all right, I'll give myself, 2.5 hours, 2 hours, and I'm gonna just kind of as much as I can tune out the rest of the world, aside from emergencies, lock in, and just get the work done. And I think most people, believe it or not, can find 1 or 2 hours in a day where they can do that. Um, I think a lot of us just don't do that, but I think you can do that. Most people can do that. I can do it, so most of you certainly can. Um, Another thing is, I think being good at something else or having something else to do or that you enjoy or that you're passionate about, and it can be work related, it doesn't have to be work related, is also important too, right? Like, for example, in my case, like I enjoy the field that I work in, the field of psychology. Um, I mean, there's obviously things about the field that I don't like, in modern day psych, but I mean, like most of it, generally speaking, I do like. I like the field, and it's very interesting. There's a lot of really cool jobs you can do, that's through the military or outside of the military. So it's been a very good gig for me. It's been something else I've been able to also focus on, get really good at, and kind of do separately from, from powerlifting. And I think that's probably one of the things that's actually helped prevent any really serious, burnout or anything like that too. And then, yeah, I mean, I also think that, at the cost of, moving on with your life and, doing things that you want, you shouldn't always have to place powerlifting on this mantle above all those other things, right? Like for me, getting married and having kids is important. It's something I cared about and I've always wanted to do. I just knew that, maturity wise, I always wasn't in that position. I think I barely got there. And but it's been good. And it's just something I always wanted, like, with my life, I wanted to have, kids and stuff like that. I've always loved kids. Now that we have one, I mean, he's doing really, really well. And, I mean, I wouldn't, there's no, powerlifting like meet or competition or amount of money or anything, that, I would trade in for having, my son and my family. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
How old is he? Just out
Yeah,
of
he's
curiosity.
he's 5.5 months. He turns 6 months on the 19th of October.
Aw, that's
So already
that's
well on his
exciting.
way of the weight gain journey, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, he is. He's gained very quickly. He's very long too. He's a really healthy baby. He still has blue eyes. I don't know if they're gonna change or not. Blue greenish eyes.
So we kind of talked about earlier, kind of like the spectrum of, the current trend in powerlifting is doing SBDs almost every day of the week, the super high frequency. And your training, just because you have so much other stuff going on in your personal life, that I don't know that something like that would be beneficial to you just because you have so many other things that are going on. So I know that your training is very, very different than I think what you would think of like a traditional kind of powerlifting type of
Yeah.
training would be. Um, so tell me, yeah, like what a typical week in your training might look like.
Right. So as you've alluded to, yes, I do train quite a bit differently from a lot of powerlifters. And I think there's two big sort of I think there's two big functional areas there to consider. I think the first thing is like strength level, strength differential, right? I have a different strength, I think, level. No, there's three things. I think I'm at a much different strength level than those people. The second thing is training age. Like I've been competing and training a lot longer than most people, to include most people in the top levels of the sport right now. Like most of the kids who are putting up, crazy numbers and training, they they weren't even like they weren't around, just like 5 years or 6 years ago.
I
Um,
know, I understand.
yeah. Um, and then the third thing is like as you mentioned, like lifestyle factors, right? And the other things that I do, outside of powerlifting that definitely affect the amount of, I think, tolerable volume in a range, where it would be effective for me to like progress, right? So I have to kind of, modify, to a pretty significant extent, like how I approach, training from, most other powerlifters, I think. And so with that, throughout a week, right? Um, I'll probably train like 4 days out of the seven in a week. One of the days I normally don't touch any barbell movements at all. I just do like really light, a couple of really light, accessories like for the lower back, upper back, maybe like the shoulder pack, and then I do like cardio that day, and I do like, active recovery and stuff. Um, and then the other 3 days I'll actually do, sort of the compound lift. So Saturdays I usually do, famously my SBD, um, and I progress that over time. And then Mondays used to be like my secondary SBD, but now I just do squat and bench for that day. And I only deadlift once a week right now. And then on the tertiary lifting day, it's usually just bench press and upper body stuff. And then one of the reasons why I like to have the SBD day, I like to have it on Saturday specifically, is because I like to capitalize on the days where I have more time and energy. And Saturday just is one of those days for me. Like I can, go into a gym at like 10 or 11 a.m. You know, I can really just dial in and focus and just be present, better than any other day of the week. And, I'll have, pretty good energy usually. And and it just works. So, for my heavy squats and my heaviest deadlifts, I capitalize on that. And I try to take advantage of those days. And then on Mondays, I would usually do my secondary SBD, or I would just do right now squat and bench. And the reason why I kind of have that day there um, is to kind of strike a balance between healthy, recoverable volume and getting a little bit more heavy exposure. So I found that like for me to progress my deadlift or to get up to near or at all-time highs, I can honestly get away with doing it once a week, especially if I hit accessories and squat and other things hard enough. On a secondary day, I'll usually do my high bar squat, and I'll usually hit that one relatively hard actually most of the time because I can recover easier from that than I can from a low bar. And that's just one of the reasons why I don't do much low bar volume anymore too. I think it uniquely actually fatigues me and affects my body. I don't know if it's like how my body like maintains the position. I don't know what it is, but over the years we've just noticed that it uniquely affects me more than any other lift. Um, so I digress. But with that said, yeah, on that secondary day, it's sort of like the secondary SBD approach. And the reason why I do it so, close in proximity to Saturday, it's usually Monday, so 48 hours. I think everyone experiences this differently, but acute fatigue, right? I actually feel better on that Monday than if I try to do it on Tuesday or Wednesday. If I try to do it Tuesday or Wednesday, I actually end up feeling much, much worse. And at that point, it's like, what's the point of doing it those days if I can do it Monday, and yes, like the acute fatigue is sort of managed and controlled in that way, and I feel a lot better and I can get more productive training. So the secondary day I train the high bar, one because I can recover a lot better from it, and I can push, the intensity relatively high and get, additional um high intensity sort of exposure. Yeah. Without falling apart.
For sure. And you had mentioned kind of how low bar uniquely taxes you. How does it tax you? Is it general fatigue? Is it certain like parts of your body? Is it shoulders? And am I correct in remembering you're not using wrist wraps when you're squatting usually?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't use wrist straps. Yeah, I think it's kind of I want to say it's a kind of a global fatigue thing, but really it's global fatigue, but it's more prominent like this throughout my entire back. I don't know, I don't know if it has to do with like how I maintain position. I don't know what it is, but I know I'm a very rigid, squatter and maintain really good positioning, even with really, really heavy weights. Um, Yeah, but I don't know what it is. It's kind of been like that for a while. So I can like train it, and I can probably, train it with some volume now with like moderate weight ranges, but we just figure, why even generate or accumulate that much, fatigue if we can push a high bar and other accessories harder and feel better and still progress. So that's kind of the route we took.
Yeah, you've mentioned that before of making, small steps and building momentum. And I know, Zach, you've talked to me about this and we see it where people may be able to make faster rates of progress by doing a certain intervention, but their injury risk increases. And while it may work in the short term, even for a year or two, somebody that continually has to go back to extremely high frequency and high workloads, or at least thinks that they do, it can lead to injury and overuse. I know that's been an issue that I've faced where I've thought more is going to be better, and you get impatient and then tweaks or injuries come up. In regards to progression, you mentioned this, look at my natty card based off of this steady progression over a long period of time. Do you remember what you lifted the first time or first, like after a month or two in the gym lifting for the first time with your numbers, and how those progressed maybe up to like 90% of your absolute top, like how fast you got that first 90% of your races?
Yeah, I would say probably. So I actually first started lifting earlier than when I first started powerlifting. I first started lifting, I was about 13, going on 14 years old. Um, so at that point, I want to say at 14, the end of my freshman year of high school, I think that's probably this is probably where I can get the most reliable data. I had a 275 bench press, the end of ninth grade. I could squat 405. But that was like that didn't count though. That was like it was a low box squat. I did it for like 2 reps, and then I deadlifted for something, over 400. And then as time went on, towards the end of high school, that's when I started like I hit like a 700 deadlift, I hit a 405 bench. I hit a six something, like low mid six squat, like towards the end of the school year. So I was getting stronger. And then once I really got to about 90-ish% of where I'm at, plus of where I'm at right now, that was probably COVID era, 2021, 2022-ish. That's when I really blew up and I got really, really strong. Yeah, and then since that point, if I'm being completely honest, like I like in meets, like in competition year over year, aside from like this last year, like I pretty much progressed, year to year, like comp wise and ability wise, but strength wise, I progressed, modestly from that point. Not crazy, but just modestly, I would say. Um, but stringing together all of those sort of lifts in a competition, one wasn't necessary for most competitions, so I didn't have to train to do that. And then, how I would have to now. And then number two, I wanted to kind of, win larger meets, bigger meets, like with relatively conservative attempts. And if I didn't have to overextend myself, then I normally wouldn't. As odd as that might sound for some.
Ashton, here's a question for you that I'm curious about.
Sure.
So your training has kind of followed this trajectory now where I would say the volume's relatively modest, the progression strategies are relatively modest, like they're all tailored very well to your situation. Do you think that your kind of external stressors that you have that are kind of unique to you are a bigger determinant of your kind of recovery capacity or kind of the way your training has looked versus your absolute strength? Obviously, it's a meld of both, obviously. But I'm
Yeah.
curious, just from your kind of perspective, which of those do you think plays a larger role in kind of that overall situation?
Yeah, sure. If we were to take a reductionist approach, if we were to oversimplify all of this, right, and we created like a spectrum, and then these two things are on the end of the spectrum, lifestyle factors and absolute strength, which one affects, your ability to tolerate more, volume, blah, 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 right? I would say on this spectrum here, we're probably like here, closer to lifestyle factors. I would say it's probably like a 75-25 split. Again, just arbitrarily throwing out numbers.
Sure.
75 being, lifestyle factors, 25 being absolute strength. Like, yes, with higher absolute strength, I do think a lot of people actually in powerlifting today, especially in tested power, I notice a lot of them don't do a great job at, I think, regulating some of the numbers they hit, in my opinion. Like, I'll see a lot of really strong guys, young guys, and they'll be hitting like 90% of their max almost all the time. And I'm like, I mean, it's cool when you can get away with it, like when you're younger and you can heal and stuff, but there comes a point where, it can lead to like serious problems down the road and like some serious frustration and, not progressing. So, why not take the longer, more gradual approach and just continue to build and build and build, like, and feel way better doing it than, but that's just me. But I've noticed that a lot in the powerlifting scene. I think with all these SPDs, all this footage, all this stuff coming out, there's more and more of a pressure, I think, that people feel to have to put up bigger numbers all the time. Like if I'm in a gym and I'm like treating, a 635 squat like it's 800, but I'm focused and I'm zoned in and I feel really good about it. You open Instagram and then, you see people, trying to pause squat 650 or 700. It's like, I've gotten over all that stuff. I'm like, okay, that's cool. But at the end of the day, who's squatting more at the meet? And if it's me, then I don't really care. Um, but but um, but yeah, I would say I'm sorry to digress, but like to get back to your original question,
No,
I think
it's
lifestyle factors are the bigger impact, the bigger influence. And I think part of lifestyle factors, honestly, is like, yeah, your social media exposure and what you see other people doing, because psychologically that might influence or affect what you do as well
I
in the
was
gym.
I was just gonna say, I feel like in multiple ways, I feel like your occupation is almost an additional thing. Like again, I keep coming back to like this kind of external picture that you have that some people could look at as a quote unquote disadvantage of all these things you have. In some ways, I feel like they keep coming back to be things you can flip as a positive. Like I'm sure your experience with the psychological aspect of this entire thing probably makes you think about those things slightly differently, and that I feel like probably has some advantages that are easy to recognize
Absolutely.
when I hear you talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like you said, the entire it's hard for me to take a step back and objectively evaluate some of the trends in training now because I do think there's a lot of positive aspect of things. Obviously, as we get more information, more lifters into the sport, a lot more time to evaluate the success of different
That's
methods.
why
We're
they're a
going
lot
to
better. A lot better,
yeah,
a lot
exactly.
younger. Yeah.
We're gonna trend towards some positive things, but at the same time, there also are going to be psychological and societal things that are going to enforce different patterns that may not necessarily be the most effective strategy, but they're the most effective strategy for making people aware of those strategies. So it's an interesting thing to kind of hear your experience with that, and I'm sure you're able to stay much more level-headed on the way that you want to approach things, purely with how it makes sense in your situation, rather than some of these societal and psychological aspects of things that probably more often people want to admit influence the way that they train.
Yeah, no, it's the truth. Like for example, I've seen people, I've won meets where I would watch guys squat and deadlift over 700 pounds just objectively way more times than I would in training, right? But again, like I think the psychological piece is huge. I don't necessarily get bothered by that. I know that if I am sticking to my plan and I know my body well, and if I'm hitting all of the things, that we've documented and planned to, go through, within like a margin of error. If we're doing a really good job, there's maybe one oopsie here and there. Like if you're doing a good job overall, like you're probably going to show up and do decent, right? You probably show up and be able to do, your body will be able to handle and do something big. And that's almost always been the case. But yeah, no, I mean, yes, I do agree too. Like, so I do think the science, the technology, the dissemination of information, everything that's available, right, to the masses of lifters is better, is way better than when I started. It's very awesome to see. And I think that does kind of lend, to a lot of, younger lifters performing, very, very well, a lot faster in their careers, as opposed to, I think a lot of us where it just took a lot of time to get there. I mean, even when I was doing really well at 20, like I was a lot stronger. I'm a lot stronger now than I was at 20. But there's a lot of progress there, right? But one thing I am curious about, and I'm kind of flipping this. Sorry, this is a question that I had for you guys to see what you guys think. Do you think that as younger lifters have more access to better technology and do better? I do think that the overall level of, record, everything is going to increase to some extent. But I guess to what extent do you think that might actually be? Because I kind of have this idea and this theory that people might be approaching ceilings faster, but not necessarily, at their ceilings at like 23. But I think they may be a lot closer to it at 23 than maybe in the past.
I think you're spot on. I think that as coaches, as someone who wants to think the influence that we have on the methods that we're allowing athletes to reach their peaks and hopefully even higher peaks are a really big contributor. I think if we're all honest with ourselves, the biggest contributor by far is just a number of people that are influxed into the sport, and just you're just basically playing a numbers game in terms of how many people are getting exposed to the trends of those world records. I think our methods, like you said, I think are probably more efficient at this time than they were in the past, but I don't necessarily think that there's going to be any revolutionary kind of advancements that we're going to make from a training perspective that are just going to completely blow out the bounds. It's more so just going to be an exposure thing of how can we get the most talented, the most genetically elite individuals, just from a raw potential perspective, into the sport, and continue to want them to train for 20 years in the sport of powerlifting to actually manifest those gains that can be had from a good training program in general. And that's the part of things that's more challenging in this sport, which I'm sure I don't need to tell you, in terms of the enforcement mechanisms of rewarding the athletes to stay in the sport long term. A lot of it needs to be intrinsic from what I can see. But yeah, that's my perspective. I don't know if you guys disagree, but I definitely think, again, for somebody who wants it to be the case that we can really strongly influence those ceilings or apparent ceilings, I think it's probably the minor factor, even though obviously it's helpful.
I actually had a very similar conversation. I said this to Candido, like I think Johnny Candido, one of my good friends, like 3 years ago. And basically I told him, I'm like, well, now we're seeing, like kind of, like an influx of more, I think, genetic outliers in terms of like ability to create, to build muscle mass, to, produce force and stuff like that. We're seeing more and more of them enter the sport. So we're seeing like records, because it was like that kind of era of like 2020, like 2 or 3-ish, where records just started exploding. Like I think in tested powerlifting, outside of, I think, super heavyweights, I think I was actually the first guy to hit 2K raw. And then I was the first one to hit 2100 raw. And then, like mid 21, like it just kind of took off. Like it felt like exponentially at the time. But now you've got plenty of guys doing it. And and I think that you have, and some of those guys, like some of them I know, like they were, like also D1 athletes, or one of my friends was in the NFL. Like, they did different things and then got into, powerlifting and did very well. So yeah, I do think the influx of like genetic talent is a factor. And then I also think, yeah, like if you're a really good lifter when you're really young because you've had better access to all the technology, training and stuff like that, and you're a genetic outlier and you're actually just really strong, then it's like in 3 years, like you're probably top 2 or 3 in the world. What's the incentive to go 17 more years in that sport? Right? You know what I mean?
Yep.
A lot of people will have like those kids, those people could have 20 years of like really good, solid training and really push the envelope. Whereas I think like fellows like myself or others, you have 10 years of like, good training still, but kind of also figuring it out. And then if you decide to do the other 10 years, then it's like 10 years of like really good training. There's a difference. Yeah.
Kristen, you and I should probably respond to this as having been around for a while and
Yeah.
maybe in our sunset years. I'm curious what you think, Kristen. And if I were to summarize your question, just to get back to what it is, was your question, do we think that due to changes or maybe refinements in training methods, genetic outliers, which there are more of them because we have a higher population now in the sport, people who think of this as a live option, like you said, D1 athletes or people in the NFL that would never have considered powerlifting 30 or 40 years ago because it was so niche, now might be interested. We have more people, means more potential for genetic outliers, but also training methods that expedite their approaching of maybe 95% of their top end in a shorter time frame, maybe 3 years instead of 8 years or something like that with submax. Is that the question that you're bringing to us, Ashton?
Yes. Yeah. That's pretty much. Yeah. That's pretty much like. Do we think people are approaching ceilings a lot faster, or do we think it's a combination of that and a lot of like just really good talent getting into the sport now?
Yeah, Chris, what do you think?
So I will say that, and I'm gonna kind of go off topic for a little bit. Before running a marathon, and I think, or a 5-minute marathon mile, like that was, and this is like, I don't know, I'm making a number up, like 1960s, whatever. I could be completely wrong in the time frame, but that had like never happened before, right? Like that was like, oh my God, there's no way that someone can run a, consistent 5-minute mile. And then someone did, and then maybe a year or two later, it's like you get more people who are able to do this. And then it goes to, I don't know, maybe like a 4-minute mile or whatever. But it's like, at what, is there a ceiling? And I think that that's kind of similar with powerlifting, right? Where you said you were the first person to total 2K, right? And so a couple of years later, it's like other people are doing it. And I think, yes, it's one, that more people are getting into the sport, it's popular, but also when you see someone else doing it, it's like you realize that you're capable. And then it kind of becomes this like a mindset, like I can do this. And
Yeah.
it's so interesting because you think of powerlifting as a sport, and like 100% it is. But your mindset going into that PR is going to make or break whether or not you make that lift.
Absolutely. I agree. Yeah. I actually talked about this on another podcast. I think the psychological, impact like on your training, on your lifts I think it's profound. I think a lot of people might underestimate. I think people are more aware of it now than before, and they may see now more how it plays into it, but I think the effects can be profound. Especially, for certain lots of people. Yeah. I think it can be profound. So that's a really good point.
So just
I-
kind
Oh,
of
go ahead.
go ahead.
It was 19, I think it's 1954, by the way. So very good off-cut guess for that. Breaking the
1954. Okay, I was close. Was it 5 minutes?
Yeah, it's breaking the sub 5-minute miles.
Yeah.
Started broken.
And now it's like a 4-minute. Have they hit 4 minutes yet? I don't even know.
Yeah, they've gotten
Anyway.
under 4. They've gotten under
Okay,
4.
okay. Now, and then the next one's going to be like a 2-minute or something. Who knows, right? Like at what point is that ceiling, like that genetic ceiling,
Bionic
even
superhuman.
possible?
Yeah.
Yeah, like who knows, right? So I guess with that said, what do you think of like the future of powerlifting? Maybe this is just a question for everyone too, is we, with like, the capabilities that we have, like data analysis, and even just more technology, at our fingertips, how that's going to maybe not even powerlifting, but just sports in general.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I've kind of noticed with powerlifting, I kind of feel two ways about it. I think since like we started, I think it's grown tremendously, right? I think a lot more people are in it now. A lot more people are competing. I mean, Raw was like not even really a thing before like 2000, like the what 2008, six, like somewhere in that area. It was the Raw powerlifting didn't really exist as it does now. People lifted Raw, but it wasn't like a its own division. Um, it's grown tremendously since that point. A lot of people have poured in since that point. A lot of really strong people have come and gone throughout the years. But I think as of lately, as of like the last couple of years or so, I think the actual overall participation of just powerlifters in general raw, I think that has actually declined in the last couple of years. I think, if I remember the numbers correctly. Now, but I will also say though, the competitive depth of like the people who are the best in the sport, or who or you know elite in the sport, I think this is like probably the best time ever to compete in this sport because you're competing with a bunch of like really awesome, really high caliber, lifters and people. So you've got like this really super sharp sort of quality, piece, but the quantity piece overall, just all numbers, I think maybe has gone down a little bit in the past couple of years. I'm not entirely sure why. There's probably ideas that are floated around for it. But I do think in the long term, like, yes, like I do think you're gonna have again like some of your as there's more incentives, right? I think human behavior is largely motivated by, like reward. If there are, bigger rewards, bigger things and stuff like that, bigger incentives to stick around and compete, and Zach, you alluded to this earlier, like, then yeah, I think, top level powerlifting will continue to be what it is and it'll be competitive for a pretty long time. I mean, it's already been that way for the last, I don't know, what, 60 years, give or take. So, I think it'll stick around for a while. I think strength is one of those things specifically that that's always been sort of admired by people, something that people have always looked up to, something they've always wanted to emulate, I think even thousands of years ago, philosophers have discussed, strength and, how unfortunate it is for a man to grow old without seeing what his body is capable of. I think that's Plato. Just all of that stuff, right? So I think powerlifting will be around for a while. Short answer. I think that top level lifters are going to get a bit better. I think they're going to continue to compete aggressively to win. And if the reward system is there, I think you'll keep a good number of them around for a few years. Because a lot of them have stuck around for a few years now. So it's very interesting to see. But in terms of the overall base and the overall number of competitors, I'm not quite sure. Right, lately it's trended a little bit downwards.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you why. So it sounds like your role as a psychologist or in within psychology is going like we've kind of, I don't want to say perfected training, but there's only so many other variations of styles of training that you can do, at least in powerlifting, right? But I guess that for you, I mean, and we kind of talked about like the mental going into hitting a 1RM and your mindset. It almost sounds like like the psychology of training, I think could be like another avenue that we look into within going forward. And I don't know, Zach, you're in research too, so you could probably talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I have tons of thoughts. Ultimately, like I think, Kristen, the thing you just said is something I think about a lot in terms of the places in which lifters look for ROI, I think is always really interesting. Ashton's already mentioned a few cases here where, again, I think your experience in psychology is really interesting because the thing about powerlifting is, like you said, at the end of the day, obviously there's things we can improve. It's kind of going to be these asymptotic improvements from the methods perspective. And I can give a couple things that I'm thinking about that in a second. But I think in terms of like training methodology, like people kind of had the vast majority figured out a while ago. It's just now we're conceptualizing those principles in a better way so that people can adhere to them better, apply them in multiple situations better. But the bedrock of successful training for strength, I think, is relatively quote unquote figured out. The thing that's interesting to me is continuing to develop the psychological skill set to know how to apply that in an individual scenario to an optimal degree. So, the concepts of like listening to your body or knowing when to adjust or like all these kind of, phrases you'll hear people say that are really, really successful strength athletes. continuing to refine those and having people be able to psychologically adhere to that kind of a concept, I think is something that is helpful for people to stay in the sport long enough to actually reach their potential. Because to me, that's ultimately the biggest thing, is that at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're doing relatively monotonous training for many, many years to become the strongest version of yourself. So it's almost less about the methods that are going to get you any more ROI in a 2-month period, but it's what psychological strategies can you utilize to be able to adhere to training for 20 years to actually become the strongest version of yourself. So that, to me, that's like being reinforced throughout this conversation is just, I think, Ashton, that's probably ironically one of your biggest strengths outside of your actual strength, is that your mind, I think, is very, very well developed for the types of strategies and mindset that is required to actually reach your potential. Is that you need to be able to psychologically commit to the fact that you're going to be doing a relatively monotonous task for a very long time, and approaching that with the correct mindset to actually achieve these logarithmic gains over the long run.
Yeah,
so I think that's really, really interesting. Yeah,
because it can be very easy to fall out of love with that, after the butterflies subside, and then you're just like, I'm just doing this every day and it hurts.
Exactly.
And why am I doing this? And I'm not getting rewarded for it. And I don't see a reward in the foreseeable future. But, I mean, you really, really have to, look at it in a different way. I would even say, from the psychological standpoint, I would even say even on game day, it matters too, right? For you and for the people that you're going against, right? Like some things that I think just subjectively have influenced competitions for me. And I can't speak for the other people I competed with. So this isn't like, don't take this as hard factor or, anything, but this is just kind of what I noticed. Like one thing I noticed, for example, is like, it's just like famously, I do very big jumps in meets, right? Between attempts, especially on squat and deadlift. I think part of that is like a lot of people are holding their breath when I'm doing like my second attempt, like squat. And, they're like, well, if he misses it, he's really in trouble because his opener was like, 50 kilos lighter. But then I'll get it, and then it'll look good, and they'll be like, oh, he's probably going to go up, And now he's also just increased his subtotal by 50 kilos, even though he was behind everyone. Now he's like first or second in the group. And then I get a third attempt, and it's a bigger squat, and they're like, oh, now he's really ahead. And so now for them, it creates
momentum.
Yeah, now it creates crunch time for them. And for me, I've hit the squat I wanted to hit, but I did it with, one of the 3 attempts, at minimum being below 90% of my max, right? So like objectively, I'm also tiring myself out less throughout the day. And then, bench press, that's a blur. And then like we get to deadlifts, right? And it's really funny, like when I deadlift, because I do the same exact thing. It's a little bit riskier with deadlift in my opinion, but I'll take a very big jump from first to second attempt. And then that second deadlift usually solidifies a massive total. And now people have to start deadlifting or hitting really big numbers or PRs in order to be able to like outclass me or win, especially for what I'm putting on the third. And then the third, it's a coin flip. Maybe I'll get it, maybe I don't. Actually, a lot of times, it would be like maybe a 2-to-1 call. Like I would lock it out, but I'd get a 2-to-1 for whatever. And then, maybe miss it, maybe not. But other people they'd have to load up like PRs or big lifts. Like imagine like, you're trying to total like 2150, or whatever. And now you have to load up an 865 deadlift or an 870 deadlift to beat me. And you may or may not have never done that before. And it's like, oh gosh, like, and it's the end of the day. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's a really tough thing. And they've already done over 800 on another attempt. And like, it's a lot. So I kind of I think the way that I take those like jumps and I like just crush like those second attempts and stuff like that, I think it does something to people that I compete with, where it kind of puts like the pressure on them. There's like this added pressure. And I think, mistakes are more likely to happen when that added pressure is there. But again, that's just my observation. That could be totally false. But it's something I've noticed over the years. Yeah.
I'm going to term that the pulling the rug out from under your component strategy here, Ashton, just making them think they're safe and then no, gotcha.
Yeah, so, give them a little hope at the beginning and then
and then shut the door. That's funny. Yeah, I've been on the receiving end of that. Not from you, other deadlifters, where I was always having to chip in, and that mindset definitely, I think it would play a role with a lot of people, where you just have to be able to go for it and just see what's there, and for you to be not stressed out where you're thinking, oh, I better have a high second attempt so that if I miss it or get 2-to-1 red, I can make a either retake or a small jump. You're not coming at it from a position of fear. You're coming from a position of, I'm going to be gaining momentum and utilizing this as a tactic. And that takes your own form of mental fortitude to not start, 92, 96, 100% for your attempt selection.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it. And I actually like that strategy a little more. Now, granted, I think I think it's a little bit exaggerated, but I do see people a lot taking super heavy attempts that are like really close. I know we're kind of veering off now, but this is still psychological stuff. So when I went to the World Championship, for example, right, when I went against Anatoly, Emil, and all those guys, right, like when I would watch Emil or Anatoly do his squats, right, I observed him in the warm-up room and everything. This guy did so many warm-ups. He did like a million warm-ups. I did like 3 warm-ups or 4 warm-ups. Like, and he did like a million, right? And he goes out and like, I see him hit like, I think 650 and then like 717, like all these warm-ups. My opener was 717, and then I did 793, then 804 or 805. Right? Like when I saw him, it's efficient, right? When I saw him, it was like he did like lift, and then he goes out, and then his opener I think is like 770 or something, and then he goes like 790, and then he goes like 8, whatever. And I'm like, and I know like with him historically, like his grip on deadlift and stuff, like he drops deadlifts. I'm like, dude, you are just like murdering your body before you even get to deadlift. And then lo and behold, that day on deadlifts, he couldn't hold anything past his first attempt, and he just looked exhausted. And he did the same thing on deadlift. He had all these crazy warm-ups. And I don't know, maybe he's always trained that way and lifted that way and stuff, but I think there is actually merit to finding a good balance for you, right? Between, picking attempts that are heavy enough to prepare you adequately for the following attempts so you can have a successful meet, stringing together good attempts, but not to the point where all the attempts are such a high percentage of your max already that you're just exhausted by the end of the meet. And if you need to pull for a win, you can't now. So that's a thing too.
Yeah. It's basically just, as you just laid out, what I would consider you took 2 second attempts and 1 third attempt, and they were all really narrowly together. I do think the way you train, though, even if we think of your weekly progressions, there's large jumps between weeks. There's so many things about how you train where you're not chasing immediate gratification. You're not trying to always have the heaviest training lifts every week. These are all non-fear-based decisions, in my opinion, where you're not being frantic or you're not needing to prove yourself. And because you're not constantly proving yourself, either to yourself or to others, you can bring that mentality to the meet. And it's really interesting to see like the whole picture of how your training and your meet experience really has a lot of overlap.
Yeah. That's exactly it. I train how I fight, right? So when I train, I take those, big jumps in training. I mean, even intra session, like if I'm squatting, like, for example, there have been days where I would squat 750. I won't recommend this to most people. And my last warm up was like 600. And then I put on 750, and I'm kind of like putting my back to the ocean. I'm like, oh, it's all or nothing. Like you have to do it or you're not going to do it. Right. And in my mind, I'm like, but you're going to do it. So, and then I would do it and it would turn out fine. Now I might actually, build in like one heavier, like the last time I did 760, for example, like a week ago, I did 700 as the last one and then 760, which is still a sizable jump, but I was a lot more comfortable hitting the 760 after the 700. But still, like, but from the week before, even the squat the week before was 705, and then before that 650, before that 605. This block is going to be similar, right? I do take those big jumps, week to week. I also take those big jumps intra session too with a lot of the lifts, especially with squat and deadlift. And I take the most ridiculous jumps with deadlift usually. Yeah, but it's a good thing though, like because I mean for me psychologically I'm like, okay, if I can hit this weight without really, warming up adequately or hitting a lot of warm ups and stuff like that, in a competition setting, like there's no reason I shouldn't be able to do at least this number, like this day, unless something catastrophically goes wrong, which I can't account or control for, right? So focusing on the things that I can control and the variables I can control. And even that training, like those big jumps, that's also psychological. And that gets you used to overcoming fear and things like that too. Because it can be pretty scary getting under like a 750 squat if you touch like 600 and it didn't feel that good, right? Which there's been plenty of those days. So Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Just for whatever that's worth.
But for when you're competing in game day mentality, since we're talking on it, what's your like pre-lift hype, or what's your level of arousal that you'll bring from maybe even from the first attempt to a third attempt? Are you coming in pretty level, all of them? Are you cranking up the music and just going crazy? How does that differ, or is it the same in competition versus in training?
Yeah. It's something that I've had to all the time. It used to be pretty intense all the time when I was a bit younger. But that's not sustainable, right? So I've adjusted that too. Usually like the first like 2 weeks of training, I don't get particularly, I go in relatively level-headed. I mean, I go in with enough umph to move like weight with authority, get the job done. I treat it very seriously, but I don't go in with the same level of like arousal or anger as I would like a much heavier day where I'll be probably a little bit angrier in the gym, just like noticeably. Like there will be like energy seething off of me, like I'll just be kind of hot. But yeah, the competition, it's the same thing. Like that first attempt, I'm usually a little more even keel. I really focus on execution, on getting the job done, making it, go pretty well. And then that second attempt, I usually amp it up a bit. And then that third attempt, I amp it up a bit more. Um, the one exception to that, I think, is bench press. I stay relatively even keel throughout most of bench press because if I get too amped up, I make too many mistakes. And then, I'll have like, near 500 and it'll go well here, and then I'll just mess up at the end because something like positioning wise is off or something because I rushed a setup or. So I've learned to be a little bit more even keel when I bench. I still get a bit, like there's still some arousal and excitement, but it's not nearly the same as like a squat or a deadlift. I think I probably experienced the most like arousal, aggression-ish, like, sensation when I'm like deadlifting, probably conventional deadlifting. Because again, sumo, if I do that, I make more mistakes and then I might miss a lift. But conventional, it doesn't matter. For me, it doesn't matter. You either get it or you don't. And yeah, that's pretty much how that works for me.
Yeah,
Ashton, I remember you, I want to say it was Arnold, and I think you went to pull sumo, you missed, and I could be wrong about this. You come back for your third and you pulled it and got it conventional.
Yeah, I've done that.
Okay.
I think in 2 meets. Yeah, I've
And
done it.
what was your like thought process when you're like, oh, I'm just gonna switch it up in the middle of a meet?
Yeah, so at the Arnold, I remember that meet. When I was at the Arnold, when that happened, my second attempt sumo, I don't know what it is with sumo. I've felt very strong on sumo before. I've almost locked out 900 on sumo, like, but there's been, and I was like 23 when I did so. That was a long time ago. And I have more muscle now than I did then. So part of me thinks I could probably get that, truthfully, but I digress. But at that point, like once in a blue moon, there's like something that happens with my sumo. I don't know if it's like it's also kind of like a hyper specificity thing almost. Like if I train it too much or if I train it twice a week for too long or something, it just starts to feel wrong. The lift just starts to feel foreign and unnatural. And that's kind of what happened on that day. It just felt wrong and unnatural. I'm like, if I try to do this on the third attempt and I really try to slow it down, it's 826 pounds. It's probably not going to go the way I want it to. So let me just do what I know I can do, you know, and, let me throw my hat in the ring, do it conventional. If I do it, I win the meet. If I miss it, then, I miss out on some money. So again, just kind of push her back to the ocean and, you really give yourself a choice. And I'm like, I've done this convention before. Surely I can probably pull it off now. And it happened. So even at Sheffield, I did the same thing. And I think that one was a 2-to-1 call as well. And I'm pretty strict with rules, but I honestly think that was a good deadlift. But I digress again. But I did the same thing at Sheffield because I don't know what it was. Just that day, it felt foreign and it felt off. Like my calves, like things just didn't feel right. I was like, I'm gonna have to pull this conventional. And Marcellus knew, like, so he knows, like, that's what I do. So I went out and I pulled the conventional even at Sheffield, and I actually locked it out. I got it. And that actually would have placed me way higher in the meet too if that lift had counted, unfortunately. But I think the pec tear and the imbalance probably affected that lift too. But yeah, all that to say, like, yes, that has happened. It's not a rumor. I've done that, and it actually worked out a couple of times. I think one of the things for me is for conventional, even if I don't train it directly, if I train, sumo relatively heavy, if I'm still deadlifting heavy, And if I'm still, squatting very heavy, which I did regularly, then my conventional deadlift can generally show up pretty strong still within within a reasonable range. Like my meet conventional PR I think is 843. In that cycle, I did train conventional though, but the heaviest weight I touched in training was 793. So there's a 50-pound differential there. So even training conventional, like to tie all this back together, like psychologically, I have to approach that differently too, because I know if I feel good on game day, I'm going to pull way more in the meet than I'd ever do in training, conventional now. So that's another thing too. But yes, I'm sorry. Go back to the original. Yeah, that did happen. It happened in a glorious fashion too.
Garrett, you had a question.
I had lots of questions. I'm just thinking, Ashton, right now, I'm going to move to some specifics because oftentimes in these discussions, we'll talk general, I was really low volume or high frequency, and we don't put like X's and O's to that for the audience. So I want to do that since you were nice enough to send your previous block, and Zach spent some time trying to replicate that and see how close Evolve could get. But so much of this conversation revolves around, one, what an app or a training program can never do. You've mentioned Marcellus multiple times, your own analysis and observation of yourself and of other lifters. I've been listening how many times you say observe, and you're really looking around and analyzing so often, which makes sense as a psychologist, which is your profession. And so the coaching aspect of this and knowing yourself is so important. People may hear this and try to emulate it themselves, but that may not be their style. There are other ways to do this. There are other valid ways to do this. But yeah, I have lots of questions about that, but also a lot of the same things. I could never train sumo twice a week, ever. And the only reason I do conventional is because every time I push it, my back goes out every time. It was the first injury I ever had lifting back when I was, 20 in my 20s, and I can never get back to doing it seriously for whatever reason. So that aside, I'm going to share the program. I want to just talk a little bit about like high level training split. And then I would like to, as Zach goes and has looked at it, talk about some of the specifics in your training. And if we can, like hone in on some of them and trace the coaching decisions. Because my assumption is, and we'll get there, that when you first started working with Marcellus, your programming probably didn't look completely different. But I'm assuming there's quite a few changes that have taken place over time that's part of that iterative process. So let me see if I can get this shared here. And let's start with a kind of high level training split here. We've got, I noticed when we looked at your programming, and Zach, feel free to chime in here, that again, the volume is fairly low in terms of sets for competition specific lifts, but there'll often be secondary movements like the high bar here that's going to be on the same day, it's going to follow up. And I think you mentioned that was about back fatigue. There's also going to be different protocols for bench press. So if I pop in here, we're seeing some singles that are raising throughout the weeks, followed up by, I believe, submaximal volume work sometimes. I think I saw some 225 work in there in this program that you sent. A lot of accessories following up. Like as I roll through here, I won't comment on every day, but a lot of assistance movements. And I've mentioned your physique before. I know a lot of people attempt to kind of get the bodybuilding or the larger muscles with isolation movements. But I wonder if some of this is about general work and you can establish a tremendous physique with the big three as well. It really depends how you use them.
Yeah, you can. I think you can.
Zach, what do you have to say in terms of when you looked over this program?
Yeah, I think so there's obviously many interesting kind of quirks and things about the specific strategies you've landed on. I would say the number one thing, and this has kind of been a theme recently, I would say the pacing of each individual exercise is very, very intentional from what I could tell. Particularly when you kind of take a step back and look at the grander program in general, in terms of how multiple exercises for, whether it's the different benching exercises or even your accessories, kind of all of the progression schemes kind of build together in this grander story to kind of support your performance throughout the block. Give you kind of different places to push different things was kind of something I noticed as well in terms of sometimes prioritizing your accessory movements a little bit earlier in the block, probably when you're a little bit more level-headed, like you mentioned, and then kind of progressing each individual exercise within the kind of broad categories of SBD to kind of support those larger jumps and those higher level performances later in the block. And so I think that probably for a variety of the reasons that we've mentioned, your external environment scenario, your absolute strength, and probably some injury history stuff as well. All those things kind of come together to kind of just support the way that seems to lead to this sustainable strategy for you over time. And so, yeah, I think in terms of specific things, I think those larger jumps and that kind of pacing strategies is something your training has kind of been come to be known by. And I'm curious, kind of as Garrett alluded to, how your training has evolved maybe on those grounds or other grounds from when you and Marcelo started working together, or maybe when you really got into the weeds with powerlifting training in terms of where you started and what major changes you've made to kind of get where you are now.
Yeah, so when Marcellus and I first started working together, the training looked similar. However, I would say that there was quite a bit more in the way of volume on the SBD and a little bit less volume with the accessories, or maybe a couple of less accessories big. As time has gone on, we've kind of shifted some of that volume from SBD to the accessory movements, and that's pretty much the change that we've seen over time. Otherwise, the structure, the way that we approach training, is relatively similar. The second big change I would say is we used to be, we weren't like diehard RPE, people. Like, I mean, we did follow RPE a lot more closely on those primary sessions, excuse me. So the lifting would be heavier more frequently, a lot more frequently. And for a while it did work well. But then we noticed when we were doing that keeping up the volume on the lifts was, near impossible because of how heavy I was frequently training. And so that's when we started to reduce that volume and add in accessories. And then we realized, well, what if we can just pace to get to the numbers we want over an extended period of time instead of trying to kind of chase that each individual block? Not necessarily trying to PR every block, but, going relatively heavy every block. So we're like, well, why don't we actually pace like very slowly over like a 16-ish week period and just see what happens. And so that's kind of what we've been doing this meet. And that's kind of where that last sort of piece of this puzzle, that last shift has come in. So, we've moved from more volume to less volume on the compound movements, with the exception of bench. We've moved from hitting frequent high intensity RPEs, or relatively high intensity RPE. Well, no, let me take that back. We've gone from hitting relatively high objective loads at RPE thresholds to hitting, a little bit more percentage-based stuff, so that way we could slowly and methodically increase, that exposure over time gradually versus doing it in like 4-week cycles, just on and on and on and on. And
on that, Ashton, real quick,
yes.
Can you just give maybe, I don't know if squat or deadlift would be a better example, but maybe some numbers for what you mean when you're talking about percentages that might even be off the RPE scale, where there might even be an RPE like 5 or 4 written into the program, but it's not really that you're trying to figure out what that is on a chart. It's more of an intent-based thing. And what might that look like over a 4-week block and then stitching together another 4 or, another 8 weeks on top of that?
Right. So basically, let's think about it this way. So with the week 4 of each block, the goal is to kind of hit, so on a week 4 of a block, the goal is to hit about maybe 93 to 95% of the week 4 of the next block. And then to hit 93 to 95%, of the next block, and so on and so forth until you get into the meet. That way, you're never training over like 95, 96%-ish of your max, right? At least, and that's what we're doing for me in my case. And so from there, from the meet, 96% in the block, 95, 96% in the block previous, 95% of that in the previous, 95% of that in the previous. So we're working backwards, right? And then weeks 1 through 3, we're kind of doing this similar thing, except we're using slightly smaller percentages, and we're increasing those percentages slightly from block to block, right? So week 1 through 3, they look almost the same each block. It's just a little bit heavier, 20 pounds here, 15 pounds there, 30 pounds there. And that's pretty much how we've been progressing that. So to give you like hard numbers, for example, I won't say like the meat of the last block, because then I'll just give away all my cards. But like, this block I hit 760 with, right? For example, on the squat. The block prior, I want to say I went up to 720. And then the block prior, I don't think I even touched 700, right? I think I went a little bit lighter than that, or right around 7. And then the block before that, I was in the mid 6s, and I was doing a ton of accessories and a ton of like high bar volume and stuff like that. So that was like a extremely difficult. That training period was way harder than actually hitting all the heavier stuff. Um, but yeah, that's kind of that kind of gives you a look into how we progress that. And then within a block, right? Week 4, let's say the week 4 is like 760 or so. Um, of that week 4, I want to usually in the week 3 hit about 90 to 92-ish% of that. And then the week prior, 90 to 92-ish% of that, and the week prior, 90 to 92-ish% of that, right? So on a macro scale, we're kind of doing this, but we're also doing it on the micro, the intra, 4-week block scale as well.
And
You see what I'm saying?
session.
How it's kind of scaled? Yeah. So it's very like it. So over time, it almost looks you're just kind of it's the same format, but you're just slightly increasing what you do each time, and you're just gradually increasing that top, gradually increasing exposure closer and closer to the top end, until you get some pretty good exposure at like that 95-ish% of your max, and then you peak into the meat, the last 4 weeks.
Yeah. Just as we've talked before, and you've mentioned, you're taking larger jumps all over the place, both in the meet, both within a session with your warm-ups, and here on the week-to-week scale, like you see the full multi-level from within the day to the week, to the weeks, to the months, to the whole cycle. And as you're saying, 92% shipping back on paper, that would look like almost a 3 RPE jump each week. So you're like doing RPE 1 week 1, but yeah. I think there's 2 components to that, and I'll let maybe Zach comment on this from the side, but I'd be curious with your experience as well, that when you're moving through those weeks, your actual estimated 1 rep max of what you could do at that exact moment is also a moving target. And so on paper, it may look like larger RPE jumps, but I bet that's a little bit more level if you looked at exertion.
Yeah,
but also
probably stronger on those later days than those earlier days.
Yeah, for sure. And the other piece is just training with intent, which you've mentioned so often, of going in and getting your head right. I've never seen a lift you've phoned in training. It always looks like you're taking it seriously. It doesn't matter if it's 600 or 700 on the bar, like you're not being lackadaisical about it. So I'm curious as to if that's the case, where it's like, hey, this training always seems serious. There's no off weeks. There's different things hard about other blocks with more volume or pushing accessories. And then also from a scientific perspective, the specificity of force production with lighter weights still being specific training.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. At the end of the day, even if like the number isn't, relatively heavy, like given like my max, like a week last block of the previous block I did, like my week 1 primary squat was a single with 605, right? That's probably under 80% of my max, right? But objectively, I mean, I'm not lackadaisical. You're right. I approach it seriously because it's still 600 freaking pounds, man. Like that's, it's still a lot of weight. And if you approach it like it's nothing, I mean, if you disrespect the weight, it'll punish you for it. I've learned that over the years too. So you can't disrespect it. You have to approach it, with intentionality, with focus, with, precision. And so that's what I intend to do. I tend to recreate that in all of my sessions as much as possible. It doesn't mean getting super amped up or hyper aroused every session, but it means focus. And yeah, like even though it is like not a super heavy, lift relative to my max, if I treat it like I'm squatting, close to a max or near a max, the quality of the training usually becomes better. And it's still, hyper specific because it's still what I'm going to be doing at the meet anyway, right? Just with a little bit less weight. And I know that I'm going to be going heavier and adding more weight as I go on anyway. And I view each session as a building block in a game of inches, like I said earlier. Small win, strung to a small win, strung to a small win, strung to a small win until I win the big one.
Ashton, so just kind of to, I guess, start wrapping it up here pretty soon. For the listeners who are maybe just starting their fitness journey, what advice would you give them to build a strong foundation? And then also these common mistakes that you kind of discussed that you and I probably made throughout our lifting career. So like, we did it so they don't have to.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a few things that I would offer to a lot of the lifters just getting into it, whether you're, advanced or not advanced, as a new lifter. The first piece of advice I have is time. Give it time, right? Don't expect, even if you catapult yourself high into the ranks within like 2 or 3 years of lifting because you're just, you're that guy, and you're the shit, excuse me, you're that good, cool, but just give it time, because that's not going to be, you're not going to reach, all you can be in 2 years, right? If you really want to go far in the sport, if you're really passionate about competing in it and doing very well, give it time. That's my first piece of advice: time. Be patient. Secondly, train with intention. Like I just laid out a blueprint for people. Treat each session as it's a game of inches. Treat each session as, a smaller win, and a microcosm of a bigger win, right? Treat each one with intentionality, with focus, with precision. And even on days that, for whatever reason, if there's something interfering with your ability to do that, it's just one day, and it's just one data point. And if you lose one day, that's okay. Just move on to the next day, right? Don't become obsessed. Don't become obsessed with one tree in the entire forest, right? Don't become obsessed with one tree in the entire forest, but also treat each individual tree, with the nurturing care it needs to grow, right? That would be my second piece of advice. Um, and my third piece of advice would be, and this is more of kind of like a tested, untested thing. It may or may not be a popular opinion, but I'll go ahead and say it because, I like to speak my mind. I would say, if you are a person who is looking on social media, Instagram, and you're relatively young and relatively impressionable, and you see people using PEDs, for different sports and stuff like that, I'd refer you back to point number one: time and patience. Um, if that's a big life decision to make and it can really alter physiologically your body, I wouldn't endorse it personally, but if you do go down that path, I would probably wait a long time and give yourself many years to build. Because even in that realm, the untested realm, a lot of the best lifters spent a lot of time as tested lifters and competitors. So I'm not endorsing drug use, but I'm saying, if you go down that path, I think even then you probably shouldn't rush and damage your body. I think there is, I think that's something that should be said out loud more, but I think it's not. Because I know a lot of younger folks are impressionable, and I know a lot of younger guys that just got on the cycles of different things, and compounds I've never even heard about, and I don't know why. I'm like, you haven't even trained yet. You haven't even built yourself up. You haven't built, the mental, the physical resilience, the fortitude yet. Why are you jumping into this? And I think part of it is instant gratification and people wanting quick results and wanting to emulate people they see. But time and patience, not becoming obsessed with one tree, but treating all of the trees as if they're important. And then the third point, don't rush into, something that can permanently alter your body's chemistry, for the sake of, looking or being a certain way for a short period of time. It's very vaporous. Yeah, those would be my big pieces of advice for people. Because I've seen people in one way or another make very big life decisions and have a lot of regrets about it in all three of those areas. Yeah.
Yeah, those are really good. I really like that tree analogy. I'm definitely gonna have to use it again. I'm sure Zach probably will think of one too. Yeah, so like I said, just to wrap it up, do you have any exciting goals for the next year?
Yeah, I guess the most exciting goal. So I'll be doing SBD Austin pretty soon. My goal is just to do better than I did
I'll
at
be there.
Sheffield. Oh, you will? Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah.
Yeah, my goal is just to do better there than I did at Sheffield. That's a pretty low bar, but it's, again, game of inches. It's a step in the right direction, and it's a win. If I do better there than I did at Sheffield, that day is a win. And that'll kind of be the deciding or turning point, whether I want to do something like, medically with the pec or not. If I do well enough and, I've continued to progress and stuff like that, then I'll probably give it, because by that point it'll have been 1 year since the injury. And if I'm doing 90% plus of what I've already done in a meet, then I probably would just stay the course. But if I don't, or for whatever reason it doesn't go as well as I want, then, which I don't foresee happening, but if that did happen, then, I would consider, doing something which would temporarily, again, a little bit of time, heal, recover, get right, and then, get right back into it. So, I'm at peace with it. Either way is fine. If I do well and, total pretty big, then great. I'll roll into 2026 with that momentum. And if, things don't go the way I want, or if the pack isn't quite healed to where I want it to be, then, the alternative is okay too. I'm okay with both.
I think you
Yeah.
need to consider sports psychology coaching.
You think so?
Yeah, I think that's kind of an area in powerlifting that's probably not really a focus. And it probably, I mean, like you said, like we go on social media and have mini panic attacks because someone's lifting more than us, and then we feel like we have to. So yeah, sure. I think that would be really helpful, especially for, younger impressionable lifters. But yeah, that's all I have to say. So I don't know if any Zach and Garrett, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I don't have too much to add. Ashton, it was incredible to hear your experience in a lot of different ways. The last parting thought I'll leave is just, as Kristen, as you said that, I was just imagining the stereotype of like a psychologist versus what Ashton would be in the same scenario, and I think that's hilarious. But no, yeah, it was really interesting to hear your experience, and honestly, your wisdom, I think, is the word that comes to mind for me in a lot of different ways, both from the nuts and bolts of training, but also the psychological approach. I think is, as we've mentioned throughout this entire thing, vastly underestimated the influence that has. I kind of view it as a multiplier of everything else. And if your psychological fortitude in many ways is not up to snuff, then that multiplier can kind of hurt you or help you in an exponential way than I think people realize.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah, my only comment is to the same. Thanks so much for coming on, Ashton. I was joking with the team. It's like, this is going to have to be a 5-hour podcast because I have so many.
It easily could be. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. It's amazing to me to see how all of the pieces of you as an individual have come together in your training, in your competition style. And yeah, I second what Kristen said of bringing that more and more to the sport and putting that out there to try to help people if you can, because if you have a mentor, if you have a coach that's providing that level of insight, it can help your career go so much further because you avoid so many missteps, whether it's the instant gratification and chasing numbers, whether it's performance enhancing drugs, which probably are not the right decision for most of the people.
For most people.
It's all for the wrong reasons. And that they're just going to amplify and chase something that fundamentally was wrong at the start of it, where they see a hole, they have a void, and they're trying to fill it with something else rather than what it is, which is not the sexy solution. The patience, time, hard work, dedication, delayed gratification, all the things we know really do work, but we're trying to, people try to sell or try to shortcut that, and it just doesn't work. So I really appreciate you sharing that message, for coming on, talking to us. I hope we can do this again and dive into some other areas. And yeah, best of luck at SBD Austin. I'm sure it will go well. I'm excited to see your performance as well as Kristen's as she's out there. But thanks so much. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you guys for having me and for having such a productive and I think meaningful conversation. I hope people find it useful at the end of the day. Being useful to others matters to me. So I hope it's useful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Take it easy out.
Take care, guys.